When you take a photo in the RAW format, you open up a world of opportunity to improve upon the quality of that photo. With a RAW image, you're working on data that was grabbed directly from your camera's image sensor. That data's rich range of exposure and color make it easier to save a poorly shot photo, and easier to make a well-shot photo shine in ways you never thought possible, all by pushing and pulling a couple of sliders. Photoshop comes with a utility that is designed specifically to edit RAW photos called Adobe Camera Raw. If you're unfamiliar with RAW photos, you may have been using Photoshop for years without ever seeing this robust and useful application. To begin using Adobe Camera Raw, you'll need to open a RAW file in Photoshop. If you don't have any RAW files on your laptop and need help, have a look at the previous video. Select the range of RAW images you'd like to edit in Finder by holding down the Shift key, then right-click or Control-click on the highlighted files and choose Open With. From the list, choose the newest version of Photoshop. Some of you may get an error message at this point saying that Photoshop does not recognize your RAW files. If that's the case, you're going to need to update Photoshop. Go to the Help menu within Photoshop and choose Updates. This will bring up the Adobe Application Manager. From the list of possible programs to update, make sure that you have a check next to Adobe Extension Manager and anything that says Photoshop or Adobe Camera Raw. If in doubt, leave everything on the list checked and click the Update button. It may take a while, but you will be sure to get everything that you need. Once all of the updates have installed, it's a good idea to close all of your open programs and reboot your computer. When Camera Raw opens, you should see a thumbnail on the left for every image that you opened. If you only opened one photo in Camera Raw, you will not see this column on the left. To select a photo, click on its thumbnail. When a photo is active for editing, it will show up in the middle panel and its thumbnail will have a blue border around it. On the right-hand side, you will see all the basic sliders for editing. Adobe was careful in designing this application so that the sliders appear in the order of the workflow that most photo editors find useful. So we're going to go over these sliders from the top down. The first thing that you should see on the right is a drop-down menu for white balance. This has a list of presets that you can try out. The rule of thumb is that you want to choose the white balance setting that best matches the type of light the photo is taken under. I generally leave this drop-down alone because I get better results from using the other tools in Camera Raw to get a custom color adjustment for each image. The next slider down is the temperature slider. Dragging it right will make the pictures warmer or more yellow. Dragging it left will make the pictures cooler or more blue. As with all of the sliders in Camera Raw, you can reset it by double-clicking on the small triangle that you drag left and right. The slider below labeled Tint works the same way, except dragging it to the right makes the image more magenta, and dragging it to the left makes the image more green. When a photo is not white balanced correctly, we say that it has a color cast. You can recognize a color cast by looking at an area of the photo that you know should be a neutral white or gray. If that area of the photo is taking on a color that shouldn't be there, then your photo has a color cast. In this image, I know that the front and back paws of this cat should appear as white, but they don't. Instead, they're a light shade of blue. Because of that, we say this image has a blue color cast, and unless you're specifically trying to use the blue cast to create a mood or achieve some other artistic goal, this image should be edited so that the colors appear true to life. You can use these temperature and tint sliders to adjust the color of an image and try to balance it manually, or you could use a quicker and more accurate way to color correct an image with just a single click. Have a look up here at the toolbar above the main image. The third square from the left that has a picture of an eyedropper on it is called the white balance tool. Select that tool. Then find a part of your image that you know should be a neutral white or neutral gray and click on it. When you do, the temperature and tint adjust automatically to white balance the photo and the color cast should go away. Find some other areas around the photo that are neutral gray or white and try clicking on those. You should get a slightly different color cast depending on where you click. That's because there are color differences between areas of the image that are in direct light and areas that are in shadow. This is especially true with pictures shot outdoors. My rule of thumb with the white balance tool is to click on a neutral white or gray area that's not in a shadow and in the main light of a photo. That will get you to a good starting point. Then you can go back to the temperature and tint sliders to fine-tune your color adjustment manually. The next slider down is the exposure slider. This is the most powerful slider in Adobe Camera Raw. If a picture is too dark, drag the slider to the right to brighten it. If a picture is too bright, drag the slider to the left to make it darker. To illustrate the power of working with raw photos, we're going to look at two versions of the same image. The one on the left is a JPEG being edited in Photoshop using curves, and the one on the right is a raw image being edited in Adobe Camera Raw with the exposure slider. Both images are too bright or overexposed, and the sky is showing a bright white instead of the clouds and sunset that should be there. Watch what happens as we make each image darker. On the left, the sky goes from a bright white to a pixelated mess when we make the JPEG darker using curves. But in the raw image on the right, when we darken it with the exposure slider, the bright white sky gives way to its natural colors, and we can see the definition of the clouds and the sunset. The reason that's even possible is because raw files are bigger and contain more information than compressed JPEGs. In one raw image, there's information included that's darker than the darkest shadows you can see, and brighter than the brightest whites that you can see. Being able to access that extended range of information means you can save an image that was not shot correctly to begin with, or you can make a well-shot image even better. That's the reason we're going to be using the raw format through this entire class. The next slider down is the contrast slider, and it does what you might expect it to. Dragging it to the right increases the contrast of the photo, making the darks darker and the brights brighter. Dragging it to the left does just the opposite, bringing the brights and darks more towards the middle. I tend not to use this slider much because it affects the saturation of colors as well as the contrast of the image, and I generally like to control the saturation by itself. If you do use this slider, you can counteract any unwanted change in color with the saturation slider down here. Sometimes, however, you'll edit a picture like this one of the Grand Canyon that looks hazy and washed out. For this shot, increasing the contrast is just what's needed. A higher contrast gets rid of that hazy look, and the extra saturation added in the process doesn't look too bad at all. So play around with this slider and see if you like the results, especially on shots that look washed out or hazy. Next, we have the highlight and shadow sliders. These sliders are great for evening out the exposure in photos where adjusting the exposure alone is not enough. Because your camera is not as good at dealing with contrast as your eyes and brain are, you will often find yourself editing pictures that have highlights that appear too bright and shadows that appear too dark. That's where these sliders come in. You're generally going to want to darken highlights by dragging that slider to the left, and brighten shadows by dragging that slider to the right. The idea is to get a more even exposure across your photo so that it looks more like the world as seen through your eyes. In this example we see here, we're making extreme moves on both of these sliders. Please note that making a 100% move on any of these sliders is usually going a little too far. Just let your eye be the guide and try to make these images look like ones you would see in a magazine. Moving on, the blacks and whites sliders work similarly to the highlights and shadows sliders, except they are more finely tuned. The whites slider affects only the parts of a photo that are very close to white. In this example, we have a white flower on a white background. As shot, this photo has some clipping at the bright end that is making most of the photo appear white. If we grab the white slider and pull it to the left, it reduces the clipping in the bright range and brings out more detail so we can better see the texture of the background and the flower. I found the white slider most useful for working with skies. Pulling the slider to the left can often bring back cloud detail in a blown-out area of sky, and pushing it to the right can make a sky with only a little cloud detail appear totally white. The blacks slider affects only the parts of a photo that are close to black. In this example, there's a black lens sitting on a black background. As it's shot, this photo has some clipping in the shadow range, making most of the picture appear black. Moving the blacks slider to the right reduces the clipping of the shadows in this photo and allows you to better see the texture of the lens and the background. I find the black slider useful for adding depth to an image. Pulling the slider to the left increases the number of dark values that are mapped to pure black, in effect darkening the shadows and giving the image a greater range of contrast. The next slider is one of my favorites, clarity. This slider will increase the contrast at the edges of everything, effectively sharpening your image. It's great for bringing out the texture detail of anything. Crank it to 100 and your picture will have a crunchy, gritty, and edgy look where every detail is magnified. Drop it to -100 and you get a hazy, dreamlike look where all edges are blurred and soft. Neither of these looks are really appropriate in your editing unless you're going for a specific look that is artistically driven. I usually use just a touch of clarity, between +15 and +30, to give the image a little punch and to bring out some details. As always, use a discerning eye and good judgment when adjusting the clarity slider, and remember, it's very easy to go too far with it. The final two sliders are vibrance and saturation. These sliders basically do the same thing. They make the colors in your image more colorful. One of them, though, works better in my opinion, and that slider is vibrance. Vibrance has a more subtle touch than the saturation slider. It adds more color to the hues in your image that are the least saturated, and less color to the hues that are already saturated. Also, it does not oversaturate skin tones, so it's great to use in any picture that contains people. In this example, we're using only the saturation slider on the left and only the vibrance slider on the right. You can see on the left that our model's skin tone is really orange, and on the right, her skin tone looks more normal while the background has become more colorful. It's for these reasons that I only use vibrance when I want to boost my colors and give them a little kick. The only time I use saturation is to take color away. Spend some time experimenting with these sliders and remember not to go too far with it. Oversaturated photos can look tacky. From here on out, you should use these sliders in Camera Raw to adjust or develop every photo that you take to make it better. Correct color and exposure. Even out exposure by darkening highlights and brightening shadows. Bring out detail with clarity and boost colors with vibrance. When you're done editing your photos, you'll need to save them out as JPEGs. You should do that from within Camera Raw. First, select all of the photos that you'd like to save as JPEGs from the column of thumbnail images on the left. To select a range, hold down the Shift key between clicks. To select one at a time, hold down the Control key between clicks. And to select all of the photos, click the small menu icon next to where it says Film Strip above your thumbnail images. From the menu, choose Select All or hit Command-A on your keyboard. In earlier versions of Camera Raw, there's a Select All button above your thumbnails. Then click the button at the bottom of the page labeled Save Images. When you do that, the Save Options dialog box appears. Under Destination, click the Select Folder button. Navigate to your DPH class folder or anywhere else on your computer that you'd like to save your completed images. Next, click the New Folder button and name the folder your last name, _ first name, _ and the name of the assignment that you're editing. At this point, that should be Day 1. Click Create and then Select so that the folder and its path show up in the Save Options dialog box under Destination. Next, under File Naming, click the top left box so that you can type in it. Type your last name, _ and first name. Make sure that the other three boxes in file naming are left blank. This section controls how all your files will be named. The way it's set up now, all of your photos will be named with your last name and first name, and then will be given a number after that. We want to save out JPEGs, so set the file extension under File Naming to JPEG. Then in the Format section below that, make sure that it says JPEG as well. Set metadata to all, and type a 12 next to where it says Quality. No other sections in the Save Options dialog box need to be modified. When all of this is completed, click the Save button at the upper right, then click Done at the bottom right of Adobe Camera Raw. The next step will be to name your photos in Finder. For every assignment in DPH, you will need to name each of the files you turn in with your name and the part of the assignment that's visible in that photo. For instance, today's assignments should be for shutter speed, so you should have 5 photos that show frozen motion, 3 photos that showed blur motion, and 2 photos that show a long exposure shot of something that does not move. In Finder, go to the folder where you saved your JPEGs. Put your files into the column view so that you can see a thumbnail preview of each image to the right. Then name each one of them for the part of the assignment that they illustrate. For instance, the first image is one in which motion is frozen, so I'll replace the number with freeze 1. The next one also shows frozen motion, so I'll name that freeze 2. Name all the rest of the frozen motion files with incrementing numbers. This one is a blurred motion shot, so I'll name it Blur 1. I'll name the other 2 blurred motion shots with incrementing numbers also. And the last 2 are still motion long exposure shots, so I'll name them Still 1 and Still 2. Every photo that you turn in from here on out should be named in this manner, with your name followed by a short description of what the picture shows. I want to show you one more thing before we go. Have a look back at the folder where your raw images are kept. Next to the files that you edited in Adobe Camera Raw, you should see extra files that have extensions of .xmp. These files contain all of the moves you made on the sliders when you edited photos in Adobe Camera Raw. These small sidecar files allow you to make non-destructive edits to your raw photos, and if you erase them, all of the changes that you made will also be erased, so they need to be kept in the same folder with your raw images. So, those are the basics of editing photos in Adobe Camera Raw. Now you've taken the first step in your journey towards mastering digital photo editing.